Analytic theology is a method for doing theology, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that now. There are lots of different ways of thinking about the task of theology and approaching theology. Jeffrey Stout, the American scholar of religion, famously said that theology is so much and so often about throat clearing that theologians often fail to get onto the substantive issues of theology. In other words, they're so busy trying to get their method straight that they never get round to actually talking about God talk. It's always talk about God talk. It might be thought that analytic theology falls foul of this kind of concern. In other words, that it is also a case of talk about God talk, rather than actually doing the business of theology. I don't think that's true, and I think anyone who peruses the literature on analytic theology that's grown up since around 2009 will see that there is a rich and variegated body of material that covers a range of Christian doctrines in some depth and some detail. So analytic theology is a way of doing theology, but it's really a way of engaging with fundamental matters of the Christian tradition, fundamental matters of Christian doctrine. Nevertheless, it's important to think a little bit about how we approach matters of Christian doctrine. And so to begin with, I'll say something about that. Now, there are a number of different ways one could think about approaching Christian doctrine, much as one approaches any other sort of topic with various ideas of what one is doing in mind. In modern theology, there are a number of different ways of thinking about the theological task, whether that's the task of liberal theology, which privileges human experience of matters religious and works from there to think about what we believe, what Christians believe about Christian doctrine, or whether it's post-liberalism, which is a way of thinking about Christian doctrine which structures it around a kind of framework of language that governs how we should say certain things and not others when we think about Christian doctrine. Or whether it's something like evangelicalism, which is an approach to Christian doctrine that focuses on things like Scripture and its authority and the history and interpretation of Scripture in a particular tradition. There are lots of different ways of thinking about these things. Analytic theology is, in a nutshell, a way of doing theology that utilizes the tools, sensibilities, and literature of analytic philosophy in order to pursue the theological task. And really, to my way of thinking, that is what analytic theology is. You can dress it up and expound on it much more than that, but if you boil it down to the essence of what it is, that's what it is. Theologians have always been engaged with philosophy. Down through the centuries, from the earliest times, even in the biblical tradition itself, we find Christian theologians and thinkers wanting to engage secular thinkers, and in particular those who are philosophers, in order that they may fund and underpin their theological claims with philosophical concepts and ideas, and in order that they may engage the wider culture in which they find themselves. A good example of this in the biblical tradition is the Apostle Paul in speaking before the Areopagus in Acts 17. At that time, as he speaks to the learned of Greek society, the philosophers of the day, seeks to engage them by building a conceptual bridge to them, referring to some of their own thinkers and their own ways of conceiving the divine in order that he may help them to understand the importance of the Christian message. In many respects, subsequent Christian thinkers have done something very similar, but utilizing the tools of philosophy that they found around themselves in the times in which they lived. That's true from the sub-apostolic period onwards. And certainly it was true as the church developed and as it became embedded in the wider Greco-Roman culture in the patristic period. Perhaps the greatest flourishing of these things can be found in medieval theology, where you have a synthesis between philosophical and theological ideas that produce some of the greatest thinkers of the Christian tradition, people like Anselm of Canterbury or Thomas Aquinas. But the tradition continues beyond the Reformation into the Enlightenment, through the 19th century, and right up to the present day. In many respects, analytic theology is simply a modern equivalent to the sorts of philosophically engaged theology that Christians have been carrying out down through the centuries. The difference is simply that it engages a particular philosophical tradition, one that has grown up in the 20th and 21st centuries. For much of the 20th century, Christian theologians were particularly engaged with what's sometimes called the continental or hermeneutical tradition of philosophy. This is a way of thinking about the philosophical task which privileges a certain kind of history, a certain set of ideas, and a particular way of approaching the philosophical task, which is really concerned with the manner in which human beings try to figure out how they ought to live in the world in which they find themselves. And a number of great thinkers in this tradition, from Immanuel Kant onwards, have sought to reflect on these matters in this genealogical tradition that continues to the present day. There are a number of different strands or streams within so-called continental or hermeneutical philosophy, many of which privilege this kind of existential turn, the idea that somehow human beings are engaged in the world in which we find ourselves, and we try to find a meaning in the world in which we find ourselves in important respects. Much 20th century theology is reflective of this genealogical turn. So if we were to look at some of the great thinkers of 20th century theology, from Karl Barth through to Hans Frey, they are in many respects engaged with the continental way of doing philosophy. There is another tradition, though, another tradition of philosophy that grew up around the beginning of the 20th century and flourished in the post-war period and up to the present day, sometimes called Anglo-American philosophy, or the analytic tradition. The analytic tradition, as it's sometimes called, is an unfortunate name, really, because it's a name that pertains to one phase of the life of this philosophical tradition, the phase of the life of the tradition that flourished in around the 1950s, where the focus of attention was on the analysis, the philosophical analysis or linguistic analysis of human language, ordinary language philosophy. And the idea was that through thinking hard about ordinary sorts of language, we can burrow down to really fundamental philosophical ideas. Some philosophers in this tradition at this time thought that really we could dissolve philosophical ideas simply by attending to how we understood language. But in fact, philosophical analysis is not the only thing that analytic philosophers do. There's been analytic philosophy that's dealt with all sorts of things, and in the first phase of its life, it was particularly thought to be a kind of acid that dissolved all sorts of traditional ways of doing metaphysics, the kind of metaphysics talk about being as being, talking about what exists in the world that theologians think is terribly important. But this too is only a phase of the life of analytic philosophy, and since the 1970s onwards, we've seen what's sometimes called the metaphysical turn in analytic philosophy, where analytic philosophers have got back to the traditional task of philosophy, the task having to do with being and these big concepts about what is in the world around us and how we should understand the world, and have spent an awful lot of their time trying to figure these things out. Today, there's a flourishing literature in this area, and there are even people writing what's sometimes called analytic systematic metaphysics, which is a bit like Christian systematic theology, an attempt to give a systematic account of the world as we find it and the concepts that are needed in order to make sense of that. Now, in the 1960s, there was, in addition to a turn to metaphysics, there was a return to thinking about religious questions from Christian philosophers in this Anglo-American tradition. And a number of really important Christian philosophers of this period spent a lot of time trying to figure out how they could justify religious belief and how they could demonstrate that the religious beliefs that they held were just as respectable, intellectually speaking, as the beliefs of their atheistic compatriots in philosophy departments. Around this time, there was the beginnings of what's sometimes called the Society of Christian Philosophers, and a number of major thinkers who made their name in secular philosophy departments and in thinking really hard about some of these metaphysical and epistemological, that's to do with the theory of knowledge, issues, were people who came on the scene and made a name for themselves. These people were people like Alvin Plantinga, Nicholas Walterstorff, Marilyn and Robert Adams, Eleanor Stump, William Alston, and many others. They left their mark on a whole generation of philosophers who were people of faith, but who sought to articulate that faith by means of philosophy rather than by means of theology. In the 1970s and into the 1980s, this group of philosophers really managed to make a mark in Christian philosophy so that the Society of Christian Philosophers became one of the largest interest groups in the American Philosophical Association, which is the guild for philosophers in the United States. And during that period, these thinkers turned their attention to some of the most important and intractable religious questions that philosophers can ask. Questions about the problem of evil, for example. Questions about the existence of God. Questions about the justification of religious belief. How can we know that there's a God? How can we know that our religious beliefs are justified and actually knowledge rather than simply something that we've dreamed up? But as time passed, these thinkers became more and more interested in what we might think of as traditional subjects of Christian theology. So that by the 1980s, a number of these thinkers started wondering and worrying about things that might more properly be thought to be the purview of thinkers in theology and religious studies departments. They spent their time starting to think about the doctrine of hell. How can a loving God send people to an everlasting damnation? And about divine love. They started to think about central Christian doctrines, things like the doctrine of the atonement, things like the doctrine of the incarnation. One of the most important treatments of the incarnation at this time was a book written in 1986 called The Logic of God Incarnate, that was put together by the Notre Dame philosopher Thomas Morris. His book really managed to put the doctrine of the incarnation on the map as far as Christian philosophers were concerned, and is indicative of this, what we might call theological turn amongst Christian philosophers at the time. Then around the 1990s, this really gathered pace as more Christian philosophers started to branch out into other areas of Christian theology and thought hard about that as well. It was really only a matter of time between before the wall was breached between the philosophers and the theologians, and what was happening in philosophy departments started to happen in theology departments as well. Because by the time the 1990s rolled around, what we had was a number of Christian theologians who, to all intents and purposes, were doing the task of Christian theology. As the philosopher and theologian William Abraham has said in the past, analytic theology was an accident waiting to happen. And that's exactly what did happen in 2009 when a book of the same name, Analytic Theology, was published by Oxford University Press. It certainly set the cat among the pigeons. And the contributors to that volume were both theologians and philosophers who had decided that it was time to breach the gap between theology and philosophy and to ask the question, why can't we do analytic theology? So that rather than merely being the preserver of the philosophers from the analytic or Anglo-American tradition who had theological interests, now suddenly analytic work was being done by those who were theologians as well, and the literature was being taken up and used by those who had been trained in theology departments and sought to articulate the Christian gospel in some form or other. And so analytic theology was born. In the period since then, it certainly has flourished. And we have today analytic theology being done across the board. Some theological methods tend to be restricted to those of a particular set of interests, like perhaps radical orthodoxy, which has tended to be an important movement amongst those who are inclined towards a kind of high church sensibility and sacramental theology. Not so analytic theology. And partly that's because analytic theology, although it is a theological method that is recognizable, you know it when you see it, and you can point to examples of it, nevertheless, it's conceptually extremely thin. It commits its practitioners to very little. Analytic theology, by definition, being simply a way of approaching the theological task using the tools, sensibility, and literature of analytic philosophy, is really only asking its practitioners to look and read and pay attention to a certain way of thinking and then utilize that for the theological task. That seems a very thin approach indeed. It's not surprising then that what we find is analytic theologians from both theological and religious study departments, seminaries, theological colleges, as well as philosophy departments, who represent a great smorgasbord of different varieties of the Christian tradition. So today, we have people doing analytic theology who are Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, those who are Anglican, we have people who are Roman Catholic, we have people who are Presbyterian, Lutheran, Free Church, Pentecostal, Third Wave, Charismatic, and the list goes on. From almost any of the major traditions of Christianity, one can find someone who is engaged in that tradition from the point of view of an analytic theological perspective. So it really is a kind of Catholic way of approaching the theological task. And this, I think, is one of its great strengths. Analytic philosophers pride themselves on providing rigorous arguments and then seeking to articulate the strongest counter-arguments in the hope that they can demonstrate that the argument that they've come up with either works or needs significant amendment, and in the hope that they can come up with a better way of thinking about some difficult issues. Those sensibilities are carried over into analytic theology. This means not only do analytic theologians prize a particular way of pursuing the theological task, one that privileges the logical form of arguments and counter-arguments and seeks to articulate the clearest version of the argument that those in the analytic tradition can articulate. But it also is an approach to matters theological which lends itself to a collegial and communal way of approaching theology. Because, of course, you can't produce an argument and counter-argument entirely on your own. So analytic theology tends to be pursued in community. It tends to be done in a collegial manner. That is to say that the analytic theologian puts out an argument in the hope that friends and colleagues will offer some counter-arguments and some pushback and some rebuttals, and then they will be able to respond to that, and the beat goes on. So analytic theology is a thin method. It's a method that's pursued in a Catholic manner across a range of different theological traditions, and it privileges a particular way of approaching the theological task, one that looks to a particular philosophical tradition, but is also one that engages people in different modes of doing theology in a communal way of approaching the theological task. Of course, analytic theology isn't a panacea. It doesn't solve all the problems. It's certainly not the case, I think, that analytic theologians working today think that simply doing some analytic theology will neutralize all the difficulties that traditional theologians have sought to address themselves to. It is one tool, and it's not necessarily the only appropriate tool for the theological task. Analytic theology does certain things very well, particularly the sort of things that require careful thinking, that require attention to detail, that require the thought about the shape of Christian doctrine, its form, if you like, its skeletal structure, how the parts interrelate to one another, what the problems might be, and how we might resolve those problems through careful reasoning and argument. And that certainly has its place in the pursuit of Christian doctrine, but it's by no means the whole story. There's much that Christian theologians want to say that analytic theologians, as analytic theologians, may be ill-fitted or ill-suited to address themselves to. So, for example, the poetic, the mystical, those approaches to the divine that are fundamentally experiential. These sorts of approaches, which are more existentially engaged, are the sorts of approaches that those who are analytics might find themselves more challenged by as they seek to address themselves to them. That isn't to say that analytic theologians aren't trying to focus their attention on some of these matters, but it is to say that there are limits to the analytic theological task, and that seems appropriate. When analytic theology hit the scene in the early 2000s, the focus was on central Christian doctrines like the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the Atonement, as well as certain matters of eschatology, the last things like death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And in the intervening period, there's been a great deal of work done on these central Christian doctrines. Today, you can find a variety of models and approaches to the doctrine of the Trinity, to the doctrine of the Incarnation, and to our understanding of the Atonement, and at least some of that work is due to the hard thinking of analytic theologians. And they've done a lot that's useful and helpful, so it seems to me. But there are also new vistas in analytic theology that are emerging, and new ways of approaching the theological task that analytic theologians are addressing themselves to in what we might think of as a kind of second wave of analytic theology, which is emerging right now. One of the most important areas in analytic theology where we can see this development is in what's sometimes called the liturgical term. In the last 5 to 7 years in particular, we have seen a number of analytic theologians who've decided it's very important for them to pay attention to actual Christian practices, rather than merely the rarefied matters of Christian doctrine that they might be able to think about at 39,000 feet. Where does the rubber hit the road? What difference does it make when we think about what's actually happening in services of Christian worship, or what Christians do when they pray, how it is that they address themselves to the divine, and what they think is happening when, for example, they listen to a sermon, or they sing a hymn, or they recite a form of prayer, or they partake in the sacraments. These are central Christian mysteries, things that are right at the heart of the Christian faith, that Christians do, as it were, on a weekly, sometimes daily basis. And these practices are really fundamental to the Christian faith. So it behoves those in the analytic theological tradition to try and think about these things, partly also as a way in which they may make some inroads into some of these existential questions that I've already been talking about and saying can be harder for analytic theologians to actually get at in a way that's helpful and useful as analytic theologians. And what we've seen is that a number of these analytic theologians have really begun to do work in this area that has been very helpful. So, for example, we can see work on the shape of the liturgy by people like Nicholas Walterstorff, Terence Caneo, and Joshua Cockayne, among others. These represent several different traditions of the Christian faith. So Joshua Cockayne is an Anglican priest as well as a Christian philosopher and theologian. Terence Caneo is an Orthodox lay member of the Greek Church who's also a philosopher. Nicholas Walterstorff is both a reformed thinker and a philosopher. And each of these different analytic theologians have brought their theological and traditional sensibilities to this task. In the same period, and as part of this liturgical term, we've also seen interest in sacramental theology. Some of these, like Alexander Pruss, have sought to rehabilitate traditional ways of thinking about the Eucharist in particular. So there's been work by Pruss and others done on transubstantiation. People like Eleanor Stump have also written on this. And in addition to that, we've got those analytic theologians who've sought to take the doctrine of the Eucharist in a slightly different direction. So, for example, Marilyn Adams and more recently James R. Cardy, both of whom are Anglican philosophical theologians, both priests and philosophers and theologians, have sought to put forward a way of thinking about the Eucharist that proposes a slightly different way of thinking about the matter, one that's deeply embedded in Anglican thought and the Anglican tradition, whilst nevertheless pushing things in a slightly different and perhaps unusual direction. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Both Arcadi and, to some extent, Adams argue that theologians are right to be concerned about the idea that in taking the Eucharist, the consecrated elements of bread and wine must in some real sense become the body and blood of Christ. But they also see the kind of Protestant concern that in saying that the body and the blood of Christ can be found in the elements of consecrated in bread and wine, we don't want to end up with some strange and unusual metaphysics that commits us to things that may seem very peculiar indeed, the sort of peculiarity that one finds, let's say, in some versions of the doctrine of transubstantiation, the Roman Catholic doctrine, according to which the bread and the wine remain, to all intents and purposes, bread and wine when we eat and drink them, though in fact the substance that undergirds the sensible qualities of bread and wine have been transformed into body and blood. Instead of this view, Adams and Arcadi argue for a less well-known medieval account, which has sort of lain in wait for the analytic theologians of the 21st century. This doctrine is called impanation. Impanation is the idea that the consecrated elements of bread and wine truly do become the body and blood of Christ, but in a very particular way. What happens is that the bread and wine become somehow personally united to God the Son, rather like his human body is personally united to God the Son at the moment of incarnation. Just as we might think that in becoming incarnate, God the Son takes on a human nature, becoming human, and becoming personally united to the human body that he takes on, making it his own, so the idea is that in the Eucharist, the consecrated elements, once consecrated, become personally united to God the Son. They become his, as Adam says, bread body and wine body, so that he is really united to them, and we can really say that Christ is corporeally or bodily present in the consecrated elements, but in a bloodless way, not one that involves a transformation of the elements themselves in some kind of magical act, and not one that violates the integrity of the elements themselves, but nevertheless one that truly unites that which is created with that which is uncreated, the consecrated elements with the second person of the Trinity. This is just one example of the way in which the liturgical turn in recent analytic theology has made way for new ways of thinking about what might be thought of as traditional and sometimes tired discussions about fundamental Christian doctrines, ones that are deeply connected to to Christian practice. So analytic theology is indeed sometimes a rather rarefied thing, focusing in particular on the matters of Christian doctrine. But more recently, it's also been a way of approaching the theological task that is deeply concerned with how Christians think about the faith that is lived and the difference that that might make when we reflect, as theologians, upon what it is that Christians believe they're doing when they worship, when they engage in liturgy, and when they participate in the sacraments.
I'm delighted that the St. John's timeline has now found a new home. We are working with the Christian publisher Hymns A&M, and the new website hosts all the videos we have produced over the last 12 years, including plenty of new material. There is over 160 videos, 100 hours of quality content, which we are known for. There is a low annual subscription fee, and all the profits will be going to produce new videos. The link to stjohnstimeline.org is in the video description below.